How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. This week we're back in the wild imaginary west with another monster encounter that I mentioned over a year ago, and that is Chupacabra Mermaids. I know that sounds a little ridiculous, and that's because it is, but I had a lot of fun with this project, and I was happy to work with Hero Forge to make it happen. I have a few spare boats from previous builds. This one was the right size, but it had too flat of a bottom, so I went with this one, which looked a little more seaworthy. After choosing the boat, I broke out some balsa wood and began adding planks to the floor of the boat so that Leo would have a nice flat surface to stand on. I glued the planks side by side till I had a board that would cover the whole bottom of the boat. I then flipped the whole thing over and shaved it down with my X-Acto blade before using a file to refine the size to a more precise fit. Once that was glued in place, I added some thwarts, and without looking it up, there was no way in 1,000 years I would have ever guessed that that's what those were called. After the thwarts, I made some oars, and I'm pretty happy with all of my upgrades, but I recently watched a video from PKT Crafts where he made a boat from scratch that was far more detailed and beautiful. You should definitely go check out that video once you're done here. Now that I had a little boat, I needed a little cowboy, so I jumped on Hero Forge and began making Leo. He's a legendary character from the wild imaginary west. Once I had the basic figure, I used their new kit bashing feature to complete my character. Kit bashing is a new feature for Pro and Pro Plus subscribers that allows you to add up to 20 items from their massive asset library to your mini and scale, rotate, and place them wherever you'd like. In my case, I needed Leo to have some tech and survival gear on his backpack. Kit bash minis can be purchased in any form currently available on Hero Forge, but I have a 3D printer at home, so I purchased the STL. The kit bashing feature has definitely taken my Hero Forge experience to a whole new level, and it's coming soon to heroforge.com. After printing Leo, I designed and printed my Chupacabra Mermaids using Hero Forge as well. There are a few common understandings about the appearance of Chupacabras. Some are more alien or reptilian in appearance, but I decided to go with more of a canine-looking variant, because many people believe that they are just diseased coyotes. And in the wild imaginary west, they're known as the coyotes of the sea. I added all of the minis to some wargaming bases that fit in my painting handles, and once those were all glued up, it was time to paint. And the first step in the painting process was to prime everything using my airbrush. And while I paint these minis, I'd like to tell you a little story from the wild imaginary west, as well as give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. In case you aren't familiar with Leo and his involvement in the wild imaginary west, he's an old cowboy who spent most of his years wandering the wilderness alone, prospecting, trapping, hunting, gunslinging, and doing whatever cowboys do. In his old age, he's put most of that stuff behind him, but he still wanders the west, taking note of all of the wildlife and landscape that he happens upon and writing it all down in his journal. Leo is incredibly well known in the Wild West, and many stories have been told about him. Not all of the legends are true, but nobody doubts that they all could be. One such story is this encounter that I'm depicting here. The story goes that Leo had rowed his rowboat along the Gulf Coast, following it as far as the Yucatan Peninsula, observing the behavior of giant sea turtles. One evening, in search of water, he portaged his boat inland a little ways and discovered a massive pool with incredibly clear water. A short distance away, he found another one, and another one, and another one. For the sake of discovery, Leo lowered his boat into one of these pools and began exploring. Shortly after getting into the pool, he noticed what he thought might be dolphins beginning to swim deep beneath him. It seemed as though they had appeared from nowhere, but he later discovered that the creatures hunted from pool to pool using a network of tunnels that connected the pools to each other as well as to the ocean. When the creatures began to circle the boat, Leo knew that they were not friendly and a fight was imminent. Unfortunately for the creatures, there were only 11 of them, and Leo's revolvers were fully loaded, which means he had one bullet to spare. After all of the painted miniatures had been glued together, I had a nice little web of Chupacabra Mermaids, and it was pretty fragile. Because most of these will be submerged in resin, I took the whole thing outside and I gave it a protective clear coat before moving on. To get this little sculpture to sit properly in the resin, I will be using the help of my helping hands. That way I don't have to worry about it floating away or sinking while the resin is still wet. For this project, I thought it would look good to make the resin round, but before committing to round, I wanted to make sure it would actually look good, so I prepped a glass of water first. I was afraid I wouldn't like the distortion near the outside of the cylinder, but I think all of the Chupacabras are close enough to the middle that it won't be a big deal, which helped confirm my decision to make it round. I got my boat out of the water and I set it aside to dry, and my original plan was to actually use this nice round glass jar as the mold for my resin. It's so smooth I figured that I could just take something hard, give it a nice whack or two, and then peel off all the broken glass like peeling an egg. But I'm glad to have discovered this video first. I won't spoil his video, but let's just say I decided not to use glass with my epoxy resin. I switched to a plastic jar, which has a potential downside of warping if it overheats, so to help keep it round in the event of overheating, I'll be using this wooden box that fits almost perfectly. Because I'm using the bottom of a sealed container for this build, I didn't have to wait for any silicone to dry, so I could jump straight into the resin. The resin you see at the bottom of the mixing container is from a previous project. Don't worry, it is completely cured. I dosed out both parts of the resin, then I mixed my alcohol inks to a nice Coyote blue. After that, I transferred the resin to another mixing container before throwing it in my vacuum pot to get rid of all of the micro bubbles, which definitely would have come back to haunt me later. Vacuuming all of the bubbles or curing it under pressure are game changers for bubble reduction. As you can see, inside the vacuum, all of the tiny bubbles get way bigger and more easily float to the surface where they pop. Once the resin had had enough time in the vacuum to become almost entirely bubble-free, I poured it into the mold, which created a lot more bubbles. I vacuumed it again once more in this state and removed some dust that probably got in there because of using an old mixing pot. I then carefully lowered my tangled mess of Chupacabra Mermaids and Leo into the resin. I played around with the positioning until it was just right. I then threw a fan on to help prevent overheating, and I let it cure for 3 days. 3 days later, I forgot to hit the record button until well into the resin unboxing, but that's okay, you didn't miss the best part. As I was peeling this plastic away, I was very grateful that I hadn't gone with glass. I used the lid that came with that wooden box as the base for the diorama to sit in. It helps hide some of those ridges from the plastic jar that I hadn't really thought about and I don't really like. I cleaned up the rim of the resin and then I gave it more of a watery surface texture using some Woodland Scenics surface ripples. Once the surface was nice and ripply, I painted the wooden lid with black 4.0 and I decided to use an airbrush to apply it this time. Black 4.0 is a lot denser than black 3.0, which means you can dilute it and spray it through an airbrush without losing the effect. The last thing to do was to put the resin into the void and then throw on some white water effects around the Chupacabra Mermaids that were leaping from the water. And after that, I called it good. Another thank you to Hero Forge for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to go check out Kit Bashing when that feature launches on heroforge.com very soon. And that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.